We're going to got to get all mics turned on. Good, that's good. Just like the early church used to do it with their mics. We've duplicated that again today in an attempt to be authentic. What's that?
Why don't they mention that in the Bible?
Well, they actually do. Yeah, it's in Exodus 20 at the very end, when God speaks directly using an amplification system of his own design. And the Israelites say, never again, we can't hear this or we'll die. Honest, it's right there at the end of Exodus 20, it really is. Now, I've got some more samples, and because I wanted to make this kind of seminar practical in this particular way for you. As you know, we've covered numbers of kinds of topics, and we still will, but it seems to me it's where the rubber hits the road that we want to be able to show the value of responsible Bible study. So often, when people don't think the Bible is true, or when they don't think it's relevant, it is simply because they've read things that made no sense. And you know, we're all lazy, and if something makes no sense to us, with a quick initial look at it, we're not interested. Especially if it makes no sense and it seems like to understand it would be a lot of work. An awful lot of people who just don't want to do that. That's more than they want to do. Oh, if it's going to be that much, So it's nice, it seems to me, for us to have a chance to look at some samples. So I've got another one here. There's a story in the Bible in Exodus chapter 4. Now, I worked on this story a long time when I wrote a commentary on Exodus. And by the way, you all should own a copy of that as well. But it is about 830 pages, so it's a pretty substantial commentary. And it's been out just a few years, but I spent a number of years working on that commentary. And one of the trickiest passages anywhere in the Old Testament is this very passage in Exodus. So I thought, well, why not for the symposium talk through for just a short time this passage as well, one of the toughest of them all. Because I'm a great believer that if you are careful and systematic and you can, if the materials are available, sometimes they're just things we don't know. We don't know why somebody went that direction. What is there about that road that they would have taken? Or why is it that somebody ran into opposition here in this location? What was going on then? Why were there populations of hostile people there? So some things we just can't know. But in this one, it happened that the data was there to be able to figure out what's going on. It's just a matter of doing the work. And I assure you, I put in a lot of work and stood on the shoulders of lots of other people who've also done the work. But I believe I came to a conclusion that makes sense of this whole story. But it's fascinating because you're reading along about Moses, and about Moses having responded to God's call to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses gets ready, packs up, takes his family with him, and we pick up the story at this point, Exodus 4:24, at a lodging place on the way. Could have been an inn, could have been just some kind of a safe place to spend the night as they're traveling on the road. The Lord met him and was about to kill him, but Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, touched his feet. Surely you're a bridegroom of blood to me, she said, and the Lord let him alone. At that time, she said, bridegroom of blood in reference to the circumcision. You know, you can read that over a lot of times and still say, huh? What? What is this? God was going to kill him? Why was he going to kill him? What sense does that make? And so on. And people have offered various explanations. And the history of this, you can read it in commentaries and elsewhere, is a fascinating history. But I don't think it means that just because a lot of people have tried and failed, you can't succeed. Sometimes you can, and a lot of times it'll be those very good commentaries where a commentary scholar may have worked for years on the passages in a given book and come up with an explanation that'll be the place you'll find the data. Now, often it's going to be in the peer-reviewed journals. It's going to be the places where we publish the minutiae and the arguments relative to the data, and we begin to build it. And sometimes a scholar will write just on one phrase within a passage and try to explain what that phrase seems to mean. But if the scholar succeeds, that's further data that we can use to put together an explanation. So in this case, what do we need to know? Well, in the prior verse, there's a threat to killing the firstborn of the Pharaoh. And that was a big deal. You know, that was the ultimate 10th plague. That happened, and it was a horrendous thing that the Egyptians had to suffer because of their national resistance and hostility to and enslavement of and mistreatment of the Israelites. They really, really suffered a horrible thing. But because that's the background, there's an ability for us to appreciate the fact that Moses is being asked to go to Egypt to make demands which, if refused, will result in the death of firstborn Egyptians. If that's so, does Moses have a moral right even to be in on that assignment? That's a very deeply serious assignment. For disobedience, Egyptians will die. So what about Moses? So that's the first bit of background. This story is about Moses' firstborn son. Without going into all the details, that's demonstrable. Third, we see something going on here that we see all the time. We see it in ourselves, we who are clergy. We see it in each other. It's not a surprise. We're remarkably flawed. Yes, your rector has problems. Yes. Now, it doesn't go as high as the bishop. That's a good thing. So there you've got a level of sanctification that's just awe-inspiring. But all the rest of us, and anybody below that level, we're in trouble. And so we need regularly to pray for forgiveness. I ask God for forgiveness all the time. I realize I neglected somebody, or somebody had come to church and they had a question, and I said, just a minute, Esther. And then 2 minutes later, Esther's gone. She wasn't going to wait around because I wasn't paying her attention. You know, and I fail in those ways, even though I might try. And then there are many, many other sins. If you want to email my wife, she'll give you a long prepared list. In fact, you'll distract her from many other good tasks because there's so much to be said. So as hard as we try, as hard as we seek to serve God, we fail. Moses is portrayed that way very honestly, but may I point this out? There is not a person in the Bible other than Jesus whose flaws are not mentioned. They're all that way. Even great guys like Job. Job's a remarkable person, but there are several statements made about him, and he himself says, listen, I know I'm a sinner, so if God wanted to punish you for just any sins in this manner, he could, but he doesn't do the whole world that way. He's punishing me way more than others who may even have sinned even more than I. So that's part of the argument, but he certainly admits to being a sinner. And even Noah, the stories about Noah show imperfection of various kinds if you know what you're reading, and so on and so on. And look at the way the disciples come across as dunces. I wouldn't say to my seminary students, get behind me, Satan. I wouldn't do that. That's pretty serious criticism. And I wouldn't say to them, have I been so long with you and you don't know anything yet? Their exams may show that, but I don't say it. So anyway, Moses is a flawed guy, and like all others, he's very flawed. And here's what has happened. he's supposed to be in a covenant relationship. He's going to be the human leader of the covenant that God will give to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and then there'll be even a new formulation of it, though not contradictory in any way, but certainly a new formulation in the book of Deuteronomy just before Moses dies for the people who are heading to the Promised Land, that second generation. He's got a big role to play in covenant. And there's another detail. Feet is a standard euphemism in Hebrew for genitals. May seem like an oddball detail, but it all is part of the deal. Furthermore, Midianites circumcised males. The Israelites were not the first people to circumcise. The Midianites actually practiced circumcision. The Philistines are famous for not doing it. You may have read recently some of the controversy about circumcision. There is absolutely, as far as I know, tons of medical evidence supporting the fact that it is very much a preventer of many types of disease. So circumcision is not a silly notion, not some weirdo, ancient, arbitrary sort of cruel practice. It really is a health benefit practice, and a lot of laws in the Old Testament are health benefit laws. That's not the only category, but it's one of them. Now, you also need to know something about Moses' wife. By the way, Tzipporah in Hebrew means birdie. That's her name, birdie. It's a word for bird, birdie. So his wife, Birdie, was a daughter of a priest. Her dad, Jethro, that we read about in the Genesis story, is described as a priest, and indeed, essentially the bishop of Midian. He's not just a priest, but he's the leader priest. So he's the bishop of Midian, if you want to think of it that way. And she knew all the procedures for circumcision. Very important. If you put that data together with it, and I would argue to you that what she did was to say the right words for a mother doing a circumcision instead of a father. Now I go back again to those words, and she says, bridegroom of blood. That's a shorthand way, I think, and I certainly have had a lot of people convinced who've used the commentary and read it, and I'm not the only person to suggest this, but bridegroom of blood is a way of saying, I'm married to Moses, and therefore, as his one flesh spouse, I'm doing on his behalf what he has not yet done. I'm doing it for him. I'm doing it as a stand-in for my husband. It has that kind of sense to it. That's what I'm suggesting to you. She knows how to do it and what the right words are. And then understand that bloody is, which it sometimes is translated as bloody bridegroom, is not somebody who's got an Australian way of using adjectives, but it relates to kinship. In other words, we're related by blood. We are flesh and blood, just as we might say it today. And furthermore, here's what happened. Moses had not circumcised his son. And here he was on his way to Egypt to obey God, supposedly, and he's disobeyed him in that area. Well, you know, does this happen? And the answer is yes. We compartmentalize all the time. Everybody does it. I do it. I know that there are ways that I am maybe fairly decent at obeying God, and I know that there are other ways where I do a terrible job of it, and I'm the worst example that could possibly be found in any group of people. And I'm sure you know that too. One of the wonderful things about the Bible is that God can use anybody. We do not have to be all that good. We should be. This is no excuse. You don't say, since God is omnipotent, I'm going to be a scumbag and watch him get glory using me. Wow, won't that be a miracle? That's really not encouraged in any way in Scripture. And if you're totally rebellious, he's not likely to choose to use you. But could he? Of course. If Cyrus, a completely pagan Persian king, can be called in the book of Isaiah by God, my anointed one, wow, that's like my Messiah. Then surely anybody God can use if he wants to. If he needs to, if he has to, he'll use anybody. He'll cause stones in the ground to do his will and to praise his name, as Jesus says. There's nothing he can't do. But he chooses to do what is logical and sensible even to us, and that is to work with those who love him and are dedicated to him and want to do his will. And Moses is really standing in the way of that. He's refusing something that he ought to do. And Zipporah, to her wonderful credit, does what my wife does for me a lot. She saves the day. She says, do you realize what you did this morning? I say, what? What did I do? As if, you know, I had pressed a button annihilating the Western Hemisphere. You realize you said nothing about the Smiths, and they're leaving next week to move to Oshkosh. Oh, gee, that's right. And it's true. I would have been delighted to just take a minute and to recognize the Smiths. Maybe in the middle of the sermon when a little comic relief would do some good. Or whatever, you know, people notice what other people don't notice, and I have all kinds of things that I don't do well. But this is a wife who saw the problem, knew what to do, saw the threat, and you know, God was willing to put Moses to death for that disobedience. And it would have been a horrendous example of hypocrisy. Not obey God and his covenant and then tell the Egyptians to obey God, and when their refusal would represent real fatality, would be a mortal refusal. So here's a woman who saved his life, Zipporah. And you know, later he sent her away. The evidence is not entirely unambiguous, but the terminology that's used later in the book is a terminology that came to mean a legal separation or even a divorce. And remember that Moses married that other woman then as well, and there was some stuff there that just shocked and horrified Miriam and Aaron, because this wasn't entirely a clean thing. Their reaction was extreme too and unfair, and they suffered for that. But she did something very important, and yet he still did not necessarily show complete appreciation as he should have. That's a real problem. So I know that the main message of this passage is not what I'm about to say, but as a tangential message, those of you who are clergy and who are married, those of you who are very involved in the church and you're married to somebody who isn't, be careful not to neglect them in the service of the Lord. Be careful to include them. They love you and they'll give you great advice. They love you and they'll save your neck from time to time. They love you and they'll watch out for you and guide you. And they love you and they'll be a good listener, and you can bounce ideas off of them. And I think sometimes we fail to appreciate how much our spouses contribute to our ministry, how absolutely crucial they are. It is a wonderful thing. And this is a great story of that. A godly woman who said, yes, I'm married to a partial lunkhead, but he is going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, and I think I better help him not die. Now that's the story. It's a dramatic story. It's a kind of a wild thing from one point of view, and any of us might very easily say, whew, this is a serious business here, this business of the Exodus and the business of the plagues and so on. And yes, it was. And God made an example of Moses with regard to that seriousness. Okay, haven't said everything we might say. Here's another one. There's a story in 2 Samuel chapter 6 about moving the ark, recaptured from the Philistines, and moving it back to Jerusalem. King David orders it done, and the ark was this beautiful ornate chest made out of acacia wood and covered with gold surfacing all over it. Beautiful long gold poles that came out through rings for it, and it held the copies of the Ten Commandments from way back in the days of Moses, and it held Aaron's rod that had budded, and it held a jar of manna. 3 remembrances of God's deliverance, 3 remembrances of the covenant and its significance. Anyway, they're transporting this ark, and they're very careful to do it. They got a new cart. They took it from the place where it was at Abinadab's property, And a guy named Uzzah and a guy named Ahio, sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. And so they had these oxen pulling it. They come to a place called the threshing floor of Nakon, and Uzzah reaches out and touches the ark to stabilize it because the oxen stumble. Now, that's a nice thing to do, right? Why let the ark get banged up or something, or maybe tilt right off the cart, or tip, or the top of it was separate. Maybe that would flip over and get damaged. So he's being a nice guy. He's right there. He reaches out, touches the ark, and stabilizes it, and the anger of the Lord is kindled, and he struck him down for his error. And you've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, so you know how he melted. You've seen that. Anyway. Well, there he died by the ark. Now, what in the world is going on? What is God doing? The guy's being perfectly nice and friendly. He's doing what any of the rest of us would do. It makes sense, and God kills him. So obviously God is irrational. Okay, third illustration, a totally different. No. Why? What's going on? Here's the content. Uzzah was a Levite. Now you can find that out. That's not a mystery. That's told to us in the text a few verses back, and you can even see confirmation of that in other cases because Abinadab's a pretty important name. So Uzzah's a Levite. Levites had very important responsibilities. They were the ark transporters. They're assigned that job. That's one of the things you did. Levites were part of the clergy of ancient Israel. They were the deacons and the rectors and the bishops and so on. Now, if you were a Levite who was descended from Aaron, then you were a priest. You were that type of Levite. You were a priest. But the rest of them were still clergy and did all the kinds of things that really we know, that any of us who are clergy know, or that you know about your pastors and so on. So they were experts in transporting the ark, and the rules for transporting the ark are laid out for us. They're quite elaborate. They're in Numbers chapter 1 especially, but in other places we know the ark was to be moved only by humans. Only humans on foot could carry it, and only by holding on to those golden poles. So long poles coming out from either end of the ark, attached to the ark by rings, and two sets, two great big long poles. So several Levites in front on each side, several Levites in back on each side. Only that way could it be carried. Not because there's something ungodly about oxen, but because the ark was so special, so precious, it represented the very presence of God, that it had to be carried by the least likely means of conveyance to cause damage. And that would be a whole bunch of people who could walk slowly as humans will walk, and not just two big animals on a cart which might tip, but people who could be very careful, see where they're going, make sure that it got to where it should be, and so on. And that's a very serious teaching of the Bible. So representing the holy presence of God, Uzzah knew the rules. He knew the rules just like we know the rules about various kinds of things. But you know, the Bible does show us that disobeying God is very serious. Does everything carry the death penalty? Of course not. Are some things sort of minor? Of course they are. But are some things major? Yes, they are. And I think it's very important to appreciate that God's not a modern American parent who doesn't know how to punish. We see those people in the supermarket all the time. Kids are screaming and yelling and complaining and throwing stuff off the shelf, and the mother is saying, "No, dear, I don't think we'd like to do that, would we?" Or something. I've often thought, I wonder if I went up to this woman or man and said, "Would you like me to strangle your child for you?" But I don't think I'd have much of a ministry left. I really don't. So there's limits to what you can do. Now, you know, our culture tells us, oh, that's a minor sin. That isn't something that should be taken. Stabilizing something, they didn't transport it the right way. They disobeyed even though they knew it was still on an ox cart and so on. So that's all right. We can be tolerant with that. What we don't understand is that God always punishes sin. And even though we don't get the effect of that punishment, Christ always did. Infinite Christ, infinite God in the flesh, could take an infinite number of sins in an infinite degree of seriousness. So every time we sin, remember, that sin gets punished. And sometimes in the Bible, those sins are also punished on the person who did them. But remember, the Bible doesn't say Uzzah therefore went to hell forever. It doesn't say that. So it's not a story that automatically says this was hopeless and his life was ruined in the eternal sense, even though it certainly was in the temporal sense. But it is a story about an object lesson. And God often gives object lessons. We need to be sure what they are so we don't misinterpret them. But that's a story that you can figure out. Now, you may find it offensive. You may say, I wouldn't do that if I were God. Well, the question to ask is, should you be God? Would we vote for you if you were up for election? Because, we all are enculturated. We've grown up thinking certain ways. What's fair? What can be tolerated? What's appropriate? What's too extreme? Which things count and which don't? And a lot of our problem is that we're unable to see why it is that God enforces his standards as he does. And there's more to be said about that passage, but at least basically understanding what happened is possible to do with some information. Now again, we're moving rapidly. I know that, and I've mentioned it before. I don't apologize for it as much as just want to be sure you understand. I'm aware of how you might have a bunch of questions on a passage like that, but I'd like to get to another passage as well that I think is of some interest to appreciate here in our last half hour now. We're down to within a half hour of my talking away, and then of course there's going to be the fun half hour where you get to embarrass me with questions I couldn't possibly answer. And so that'll be good. In Hosea, I've written a commentary on this as well, and I'm actually revising the commentary. It's a commentary called the Word Biblical Commentary Series. And I wrote Hosea through Jonah in that. Now I'm doing the rest of the minor prophets because they're revising the whole series 25 years later. And so I'm revising my original commentary and then doing the rest, because the person who did the other half of the minor prophets is in heaven, and they don't allow you to send stuff back and forth, even email. There's no Wi-Fi in heaven as far as I know. It's another form of communication. So I'm doing that part. But anyway, I've been working on Hosea even again recently. And this is a fairly well-known passage. Many people know this. They may not remember much about Hosea, but they will tend to remember that there's something about the prophet being told to, quote, marry a prostitute. That they get. So here's Hosea 1, verses 2 and 3. And it's a translation that I actually did in order to save a little time, because not all the translations will say it this way. But this is a really fairly wooden rendering of the Hebrew. When you see it this way as it's projected, that's really the way the Hebrew looks when I see it and think about the wording of the Hebrew. God says to Hosea, go take a, quote, wife of prostitution. It's actually a unique statement in the Bible. Those three words together don't occur anywhere else. Wife of prostitution. So it's not the standard word for prostitute. Have children of prostitution. That doesn't occur anywhere else. So as a phrase, children of prostitution, it's a hapax legomenon. I thought I would remind you in this session that I know some big words. Hapax legomenon, a Greek word that means occurs only once in the whole Bible. That way, a hapax legomenon. If we said a phrase occurring only once, we wouldn't, our aura of intellectual superiority would be just unmasked, and we'd be like the emperor without his clothes. So we have to use words like hapax legomenon. Remember that. That's what's motivating us. Anyway, so children of prostitution. And then we have a statement, the land has completely gone into prostitution. There are phrases that are much closer to that, though even that is slightly special in the wording. So he went and married a woman named Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, who got pregnant and bore him a son. So everybody tends to think, because of the way it's worded in most of the translations, he married this prostitute, and what a shame on her, and then they have a son. And many scholars have said well, probably he wouldn't have married her if he knew she were actively being a prostitute. It's kind of unlikely that he might do that, especially in ancient times. So probably what this is a rewrite. Here's the real story behind the story. We, modern scholars, can figure this out. See, we know. What must have happened was he married a woman. She eventually became unfaithful, began selling her body to buy stuff that she wanted that he didn't give her, because he was one of these guys who said, what do you mean $1.25 isn't enough every week? What is this? Anyway, that's the theory. And so he finds this out. It crushes him, and it's just awful, and the anxiety is awful, but he begins to see in it a message. He sees it as a kind of a metaphor for God and Israel. God loves Israel and is always faithful, but Israel tends to drift off into this, that. Oh, how about idolatry this way? How about this? How about this new religion? How about doing what the Canaanites do? Won't that work better? And so on. And the Israelites are constantly trying something other than the revealed religion that God gave them through Moses that would save them and keep them well. They're always doing something. So this must be what happened. Hosea must have gone back in his mind and recast it and said, I'll tell the story as if I didn't, discover it like an idiot. I married a woman who really wasn't going to be loyal to me. I'll recast it as if I were told by God to do this in the first place, and then make the analogy, and that'll be stronger in some way. That's really what many, many scholars say. But if you know the context and the vocabulary, a lot of that won't wash. First, prostitution is actually the most common metaphor in the Old Testament for idolatry and or religious infidelity. Why? It fits in marriage, which is a covenant, and thus very analogous in several ways to the covenant with God, the ancient old covenant, or the Sinai covenant with God, the biblical covenant. In marriage, how do you really break the covenant? Well, one way is, of course, by infidelity. I mean, that's a way you torpedo a marriage. When I do marriage counseling, and I've done a ton of it, doing some now as a pastor, one of the things I say to people is, and bear in mind that if you really want to wreck your marriage, the fastest way is infidelity. That usually does the job. It doesn't always have to. Some people are able to get their marriages back together. It is a grace from God. We love it when it happens. It's a happy result, but it's only sometimes. Most of the time, it really does cause horrendous breakage in the marriage, and often unrecoverable. So it's a great metaphor. You use prostitution as ultimate infidelity, and what you're really saying is the Israelites didn't just toy with a little non-Orthodox religion here or there. Didn't just fool around a little. They really just abandoned Yahweh. Said, covenant schmovenant. We're moving on. And so note that it says he also had children of prostitution. Now, children aren't children of prostitution because the mother was a prostitute. They aren't the same thing. So if the mother is a wife of prostitution, the children aren't parallel. They also aren't prostitutes in that way. That's important to appreciate. And it says the whole land is doing this, because actually you can find this in Deuteronomy, you can find it in Jeremiah, you can find it in all kinds of places in the Old Testament. It is a common metaphor for covenant infidelity, for typically idolatry and the whole system that goes with it. So if you wish, you can put prostitution in quotes. Now the problem is Hebrew doesn't have any quote marks. So you can't put it in quotes in the original. But if they could have, Hosea certainly would have done it. And away from the Lord really explains it. That's what this quote, prostitution, is all about. And there is a word for the prostitute, the person who sells a body, a zona. We know that word. There's also another word, kadesha, for a person who does it in connection with religion. Believe it or not, the Canaanites had prostitution as a worship option. This is how polluted and corrupt their culture was. If you wanted to worship, one of the things you could do is have sex with a prostitute representing a god or goddess. And then you would have had a kind of a contact by sympathetic magic with that god or goddess. So as you can imagine, there were a lot of men in ancient Israel who said, boy, that prostitution thing, that's just great. That's even better than contemporary music. Now, and one thing that people miss all the time is this is an enactment prophecy. That's what I think most of the commentators tend to miss this. It's an enactment prophecy. There are a lot of these where a prophet goes through certain motions. You may remember that in the book of Jeremiah, God says to Jeremiah, go around Jerusalem with an oil lamp and look for a righteous person. And Jeremiah goes all over the places. I couldn't find one, Lord. Well, you know the point. It's an acting out of a principle, of a situation. It's a dramatic way to say we're in trouble as a society. We have so far deteriorated from what we should be doing that everybody is tainted. Nobody is completely righteous. That's what it means. And you can tell it in the context of Jeremiah. It's obvious that nobody's mystified by it. It's pretty clear that that's what's going on. Something like that is going on here. The prophet's actions function as a kind of a visual aid. So what he's really showing is the Israelites have reached the point of no return. They have become so corrupt. There is so little orthodoxy left. So few people still trying to keep the covenant. So few prophets preaching faithfully. So few priests in the temple doing for the people what they should, teaching them the Bible. The priests were supposed to be Bible teachers. Wasn't happening in Hosea's day. And Hosea's in the north, and in the north already they're violating the monarchy traditions, and they have usurpers and others on the throne who are not related to David, so they've disobeyed that part of the covenant arrangement, the whole so-called monarchy covenant that gets initiated for us in 2 Samuel 7 and so on. Just all kinds of things are awry, and the north is in serious, serious trouble. Amos confirms that they are a contemporary of Hosea, but so does Micah, and so does Isaiah. They all confirm it. The north is just about to go. And you know, within a few years they did. By 732 BC, the north was reduced down to just part of the territory of Ephraim and part of Benjamin, and by 722 BC it was gone, swallowed up by the Assyrian Empire, never again to be part of Israel as an independent people. So don't blame Gomer. As far as we know, she was a sweetheart. She was a good woman, a fine, solid prophet's wife, loved him and was faithful, and those kids were good kids, even though they had to answer for their weirdo names. Every once in a while had to explain, well, that's my dad gave me a symbolic name. I know, here's what it means, go ask my dad, and so on. They had to do that. But they were good kids in all probability, and the marriage between Hosea and his wife was absolutely fine as far as we know. Now, if you wonder about that and how it relates to chapter 3 and all that, it's absolutely necessary to buy my commentary. Because, this seminar is not about the interpretation of the first 3 chapters of Hosea. So you're just going to have to trust me on that. Now, some other considerations as we I'm just watching the clock here, and I see myself as having about 18 minutes, and I've got a bunch of things to say, and I planned to be at this, by the way, it's working great for my sort of schedule in my mind. This is where I wanted to be at this time, but I've got plenty for the final 18 minutes. I'm not going with the B material now. I still have a lot of stuff I wanted to say. So we're going into the water with our chins up here just before the question and answer time. But I think it's useful to ask the question, if the Bible is accurate and reliable, and some of you came here with that assumption, of course it is. You're not doubting that. I hope you've been encouraged by some of the evidence and argumentation I've given. But you wouldn't have had to come here to know that. Maybe others have come saying, I was a little more doubtful, but you know, this guy, he tells way too many jokes, but he said some good things, and I'm a little bit more persuaded. And it may be that if you're going to be reading some of the material in the book list, you might be choosing to read two books that I have mentioned to some of you already. They're in the book list, though. One of them is titled, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And I think you would enjoy that book. It really is a nice view by an absolute world-class scholar on the topic. The New Testament documents. Do we really have reliable material here? And then a corresponding study to it by Walter Kaiser. The one, the New Testament, is written by a guy named F.F. Bruce, a British New Testament scholar. An American Old Testament scholar, Walter C. Kaiser, Jr., wrote a kind of a parallel book. The Old Testament documents, are they reliable? And I think if you were able to get a hold of those two books, which you certainly can do, and read them, none of them is terribly long, but they give good, solid overviews by very knowledgeable scholars. These are not lightweights. These are people who know the field, and they know the documents, they know the issues, they know what is at stake. You might want to read those, and maybe you're still not convinced. Maybe you're saying, well, maybe. I think of the Bible as a nice ancient book with good wisdom in it, in the same way that a Tennyson poem might have wisdom, or the same way that some op-ed piece in a paper might have wisdom. So I'm for that. Now, you would never go so far as to say a politician would say anything wise. I know that. I'm giving you credit for that. But there are places where wisdom can be found, and you might say that. So maybe that's where you are. But still, does it make a difference? This seems to me ultimately where we always want to go. What have we achieved if we've only achieved a commitment to the fact that, yeah, the Bible's an unbelievably special book, really does seem to be reliable and accurate and trustworthy and all of that. And imagine that from ancient times this thing comes and is ahead of even modern literature in that regard. And now I'm going to watch World Wrestling Fellowship because that's more interesting. I mean, no, you want to do something with it. So if it's important, why? What are we going to say? So first of all, I think it's important to appreciate that it's not just that we who look at the Bible from the outside make this claim, but that the Bible says it, and Jesus himself says it. Jesus says something in John that literally translates, the Bible can't be broken. It's a very literal translation of something that, in the context there, if you read it in John, is about the fact that, of course, the Bible is true. You can't ignore it. You can't say, I don't want to believe that part. I mean, he is making a point really in an almost narrow way, almost a way that we might say is putting a lot of weight on just a phrase in the Old Testament. But he does it, and he makes that point. The Bible can't be broken. It's one of the many ways that claims about the Bible from within it are made. That's useful. I mean, if you pick up a book and it claims to be a diary by somebody and you read through it, you say, well, it says right in the front it's so-and-so's diary. Chances are it is. I mean, internal claims are not to be thrown out. They don't automatically prove everything. So it's a claim about itself, but it also, I think, begins with Jesus and his claims. If you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, he had statements about the reliability of the Bible. He wasn't just a player in the Bible story, he was a commenter on its value. Now, we understand he's talking more about the Old Testament than anything else, but there are places such as John 14:26 where he flips over and talks about that which is not yet written. And he says to his disciples, the Spirit of God is going to help you guys get it all right. You're going to put together testimony of me. You're going to be accurate. Your memories are not going to be screwed up. God's going to help you sort out so you get it all right. And even though, I mean, I'm paraphrasing now, even though you're going to write 4 different Gospels, and not all of them were there. Luke wasn't there in that upper room to hear this. He did know about it, but he didn't write it himself. And Mark may or may not have been in that upper room. That's a little more debatable. Mark appears to have been one of the original larger group of disciples, but not one of the 12. But anyway, he's saying to John and Matthew at least, and by extension to the others, God's going to help you do it. This is a supernatural thing. You're human, but God isn't, and He's going to help you do it. It's going to happen. So I know that I will get an accurate report of me, what is said of me in what you will produce, that now we call the New Testament. It's going to work. It's going to be trustworthy. And we know, I think, that Jesus is never accused by anybody of being stupid. Even very skeptical scholars don't say, well, he's a low IQ guy. They will say he's crazy. They will say he's a liar. They will say the documents are liars. But that they won't call him stupid. So if in fact that's a reliable statement that Jesus makes, and I think all the evidence suggests it is, that he really said that, that's important. If we're attracted to Jesus and we say, you know, I think he knows the truth if any historical figure ever did. If there's anybody who knew about the supernatural, it was Jesus of Nazareth. Boy, there's the guy who was the highest level candidate for somebody to trust on that score. And he's a commenter on the reliability of the Bible, both Old and New. That's significant for us Christians. We ought not to take that lightly. We ought not to say, well, it's not absolute incontrovertible evidence of a certain positivistic kind. I think that is important evidence and not to be ignored. Now, we also have the Bible making a statement. It doesn't do this every place, but there's a very important one in 2 Timothy 3:16, in which God is described as the source author. Paul is saying to Timothy, bear in mind, now this is a kind of an archbishop writing to bishops and domestic prelates or whatever other things there are around. Anyway, he's writing to Timothy, who was a kind of a bishop over a bunch of churches. And he says to Timothy, look, don't forget something. The material that we've got to work with, that which we call the Bible, and still in Paul's day was mostly the Old Testament, he said, it's all from God. It's all from God. You can use all of it. It'll all pay off. You can trust all of it. You can actually judge people's behavior by it. You can use it juridically. You can correct people by it. You can say, that's wrong because it contradicts the Bible. That's how Christians use the Bible. It's really serious material that we put a lot of trust and faith in. I would like to suggest that if you get a chance, you take a look at something called the Chicago Statement. It's online, and I've given you in the book list the actual coordinates. But you can Google Chicago Statement, those 2 words, and it'll probably come up on a very short list. Or you can Bing it, too. You don't have to Google it, you can Bing it. And if you are a user of other search engines, they will work too. How nice. So I just wanted to be neutral, want to be very fair and not endorse one product over another. Anyway, it's a very nice statement by people who hold the Bible in the highest regard. And by the way, some Episcopalians, part of that group that put that together, there were some key Episcopalians in that original group. And they met in Chicago and they said, what can we produce something that other people could identify with? And they did this years ago, and it's been very popular since. You might want to read that. It's called the Chicago Statement on the Inerrancy of the Bible. Now, inerrancy is quite a claim, you know. To say one thing, that the Bible is this great book and unique and far more trustworthy than other books and so on, that's one thing, and it's very important to say that it really does accurately teach anything it teaches. Now, if you misinterpret it, obviously you can come up with anything screwball, but if you get it right, it's true. And this statement says, how do we mean that? Are we making assertions like anybody can pick up the Bible, say, I want to know whether I should go to the University of Illinois at Urbana or whether I should become a veterinarian? Okay, here's a verse in the Bible. Let me read that. I've got it. Come. Oh, that's it. Okay, the first word is come. It was Exodus 24:1. That's it. Obviously, and I sense that that was said from Illinois. So, you know, okay, that you can't do. And this Chicago statement says that's not what we mean by inerrancy. It won't perfectly do things for you by some kind of crazy magic, but rightly interpreted, it can really be trusted. I think it's also important for all of us as followers of Christ, which I think is a perfectly intellectually defensible thing to be. There's nothing second-rate about that in terms of intelligence. A follower of Christ does not need to be embarrassed as if this is something from a prior, pre-scientific age or something. That's a really false idea, and you saw the quote I took from the leader of the Genome Project and how he puts it. But we should appreciate the fact that there is only one person in the universe with an entirely objective view. Our views are not entirely objective. May be clouded in any number of ways, including just the fact that we're human and we can't know everything. Sometimes I can't even remember where my car is parked. That shouldn't be that hard, but I admit it. I go out the wrong door, walk, get to a place, my car's not there, and then, I don't know why God doesn't help me remember it earlier, but only then do I realize it's not here. Oh, of course, I parked it over behind the library today. Now, I'm limited to that degree, so you don't have to trust anything I've said all day, because that's obviously, it's pretty bad. Now, we know we don't always have an objective view, and we're very limited, but God, there really is a God described in the Bible who has a completely objective view of all reality. That's a very important thing. And if, as the Bible describes it, he's the author, it's a serious, great claim. So Jesus prays to God and says, what you say is true. That's a paraphrase of your word is truth. What you say is true. You know, if Jesus said that in Aramaic, it's exactly the way he would say it. He would say it with a noun, but we would translate it, your word is true. That's actually how you would translate it, because of the way that Aramaic and Hebrew use nouns sometimes in places where we would use adjectives, just a feature of the language. Your word is truth, Jesus says to God. That's quite a thing to read. And it is an important claim and not to be ignored. And if God is not only omnipresent, as we tend to appreciate very much, but omnipotent and omniscient, then why couldn't he produce a completely true Bible? And it would be easy. I mean, if you created all that exists, even thought, even the time-space continuum, everything, you're the creator of everything. You are God and you thought into being all that exists. Is there a problem in producing a true Bible? Is that hard? Is that something where you say, well, he couldn't do that? You know, he could do all kinds of other things, create the world and bring the Israelites across the Red Sea and this and that and the other thing, send Jesus from heaven to rescue us from our sins, but he certainly couldn't create a true Bible. I don't know why he couldn't. So the more you understand God, the more the likelihood is that the Scripture he put into writing for us through human agency, but still he as the source author, that's likely to be true. And I think it really is a wonderful and important thing to make. Now, I talked earlier about this book, The Bible Against Its Environment by G. Ernest Wright, and in my last comments here before the question and answer session, in the next 2 or 3 minutes, I want to wrap up with this because I think it's an important thing to get. So many people will say, the Bible's from that culture, from that horizon. It's an ancient book from an ancient cultural context, and we're modern people, so we don't connect with it. But Wright and others have shown that's really a misunderstanding. It's always, as I said a few hours ago, always against its environment. So I want to flesh this out a little bit because I really think it's a valuable thing to get. The environment of the Bible is consistently polytheistic. Do you know that every group on the planet that we know about in ancient times, every group except the Israelites / Jews / Christians were monotheistic. Were polytheistic, and the ones that were not, the exceptional group, the biblical group, were monotheistic, believed in one God. And you know, it's not until the rise of Islam, which is really, as you know, a heresy of Christianity and Judaism. Islam's a heresy of the Bible. I hope I'm not offending any Muslims here today. I say to you, God bless you. And I do not have any desire to be anti-Muslim, but I hope you appreciate that I'm contending for what I think is true and inviting you to consider it. But the Bible is monotheistic, and that's where Islam gets it. And Muhammad says he got it from the Bible. So I don't think it's any insult to them to call their religion derivative and, as I've more strongly said it, a heresy of. In the environment of the ancient world, everybody was also pantheistic, meaning everything in nature is part of God. This water, to an ancient Babylonian, would be part of Enki. Enki means the ground god. And you know, where do you get most water? By digging a well or out of a spring or something. So the ground god, Enki. This is part of Enki. It's a little bit of him projected into this bottle, but it's Enki. And the wind was Enlil. That means Lord Wind. And he is the God of the wind, but he produces the wind, and when you feel it on your face or whatever, in fact, you can create a little. I'm creating a little Enki right now. You can partake of him. That's pantheism. Everything is part. You know, the ancient Sumerians, who lived in a part of the world where there are very few trees. That part of lower Mesopotamia is remarkably treeless in ancient times. Worshipped a tree. There was a tree called the mace tree, M-E-S, and they worshiped the god Meslam Ta'ea. He's huge, very powerful god. If you were an ancient Sumerian, you didn't bring offerings once in a while to Meslam Ta'ea, you might, you know, really lose out because he had clout. And Meslam Ta'ea means just the mace that spreads himself in his head up above the ground. That's what they thought. Each tree was a little bit like a hair follicle of the god Mace. And they worshipped him because they were pantheistic. But in the Bible, there's no pantheism allowed. Amazingly, God is different from his creation. So the Bible does not partake of the ancient world view that way at all. The ancient world view is idolatrous. The Bible says, no, no, no. We are God's image on earth. We're his idols, if you want to say it that way. And the word used for image in Genesis 1, by the way, is a word also used for idol elsewhere in the Bible. To be in the image of God is to be his representatives. We're the ones who represent heaven on earth. That's what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. All of us have that job assignment. In fact, every human should, if they were willing to obey it. They know why they exist. If we explain it to them, they exist to represent heaven on earth. And then I think I've got three more very quickly. Ritual worship was big. You could be pretty unethical, pretty cruel, pretty mean, pretty selfish. Long as you worship and you feed those gods, they like you. But God says, no, I do want you to worship me, but it's always a token. You know what God gets? They take a little bit of the fat off some of the internal organs and they drop it on the altar, and it's God's part. It sizzles on the altar. He doesn't need to eat. That's not a problem for him. But he gives them ethics. He tells us how to live. That's important. Two more to go. War standard. Big everywhere. Whereas the Bible radically limits war. Now, I haven't proved that to you just by saying it that simply. But the Israelites were usually condemned by God for going to war. because war was highly restricted. Only God could announce it, only through a prophet, only with a volunteer army, no pay for the soldiers, only for the taking and holding of the promised land, and so on. Very different from just any chance to go to war. So is God a warmonger? No. Does he love war? No. Is it full of war in the Old Testament? There's a lot of it, but it's not full of war any more than the book of Revelation is. But it's not something that is the standard approach. And finally, do you know the ancient environments condoned a lot of cruelty? There's a lot of ways in which women were denigrated, for example. Children were denigrated. People were exploited. And the Bible, in every way, condemns any exploitation as sin. And so the Bible can actually say, love your neighbor as yourself. And then when you look and you see what is a neighbor, it means any fellow human being. It doesn't mean the people next door. It doesn't mean people you like. It doesn't mean people who are nice like Episcopalians are. It means everybody. We are actually people who have to love this world. We have to love it the same way God does. He loves the world, and we're in on the job.